So I'm going to talk a little bit about the beef industry. I might sound a little bit like a broken record from yesterday. I have a slightly different tilt, talking mostly about genetics, and then the second half a little bit about social sciences, because 30% of my role is as an extension specialist. I spend a lot of time with beef producers, and as we start to think about what methane mitigation looks like in the beef industry, that focus on the producer and their behaviors and their willingness to adopt these technologies is going to be so important, and extension can't get overlooked in all of this, right? So I'm going to underline some of my thoughts about how we interface with producers, thinking about genetic selection, thinking about what mitigation might look like at the cow-calf level, which is where I focus most of my attention in the state of Tennessee. So this is something that Frank just got done talking about, but I want to draw our attention to this. This is fresh data pulled on Monday morning at my breakfast table. There's a lot more beef cows than there are dairy cows in the U.S. That can't be understated. The vast majority of our emissions are happening on pasture. And even with that little, Frank cut his off at about 2020, and when we extend that out to 2024, where we're at now, the lowest beef inventory that we've had since pre-1960. So droughts throughout the U.S. have really driven down beef cow numbers, which means that the dairy industry has picked up a little bit of that supply. So the beef on dairy has been a bigger and bigger part of the amount of beef that we're producing. But these animals, even though we have less of them than we've had since 1960, are as productive as ever. And I want to talk a little bit about genetics and genetic progress, where we're at with these, and I pull this data straight from Angus Genetics Incorporated. This would be genetic trends for growth traits in the Angus breed. So birth weight in red there, staying about stable, right? So we select against birth weight. But for these growth traits, weaning weight, yearling weight, and carcass weight, those would be the sort of three areas where a producer might market their animals. You can see that there's an enormous upward trend in the EPDs. That's our statistical estimate for each of those traits. That upward genetic trend is linear, and it's continuing upwards. The one thing that I'll say, as a geneticist, I like to think that we have all the answers. We can breed everything into these animals. Francisco yesterday talked about the proportion of genetic progress we can attribute to genetics. It's very similar in cattle, but when we look at actual phenotypic weaning weights, Dr. Dave Lallman at Oklahoma State has done a lot of really important work in this space. We see this linear upward trend in weaning weight genetics, but we actually don't see that big of increase in weaning weight phenotypes when we look across these national cow-calf surveys. So there's this balance that we have to strike between an animal's genetic potential and making sure that they're being put in environments where they're able to express that genetic potential, and that's true across traits. But all that said, the selection tools, the addition of genomics has allowed us to make really nice genetic progress on these growth productivity traits, and that's very responsible for the reduction in emissions intensity that we see in the beef sector. Feed efficiency is similarly headed in a favorable direction. These are scaled a little oddly because we have dry matter intake and residual average daily gain here. So an upward trend with dry matter intake as we've increased these animals' growth potential, but we're also have animals that are gaining faster, and when you sort of put these pieces together into RFI, we have a really nice positive genetic trend there. But the more important thing that I want to talk about in the context of methane is if we get a genetic selection tool, what can that do for us? And there's sort of three nice little case studies here. Two of these, so the red and the green, are angle and claw. These are our foot score EPDs that Angus has come out with in the last few years in response to some challenges that they saw in that breed with foot and leg structure. And then the third one rather in blue is hair shedding. That's an adaptive trait that Angus just recently published an EPD for. And so these are genetic trends, right? And what I'll walk you through the history of these traits. The important thing to keep in mind, a lower value for each of these traits is a more favorable phenotype in the animal. So a lower hair score means that they're going to shed off their hair earlier in the season. A lower claw and angle score mean that their feet are at a more optimal sort of range in what we're looking at phenotypically that would end up in positive structural soundness. So what we see effectively is that claw and angle, particularly as we get into the 2000s and 2010 is when those scores peak. They're at their worst genetically. This is before we have selection tools for those two things. Angus breeders were using an index called dollar beef very, very heavily, and that really backed them into a corner because this trait that they should have been focusing on a little bit wasn't integrated into the index. So unchecked feet and leg scores got really out of hand, but then Angus in about 2010 starts collecting these phenotypes at a really high level, publishes EPDs, and you can see that really quickly that genetic trend heads back downwards, which is ideal for both of those traits. We see something similar in hair shedding. This is a trait that's been out for 2 or 3 years, but you can already see that genetic trend. Once we deliver a tool to producers, they use it, and it affects the genetics of the entire population. And the important thing to keep in mind as we think about what a genetic evaluation for methane would look like is that this is going to happen at a seed stock level and trickle down into our commercial operations. We're probably not going to be out measuring methane on large numbers of commercial cows with the intent of making a genetic prediction tool. We're going to have to work very, very closely with our breed associations, defining, standardizing what these methods look like, but still being able to find what emissions quantification looks like in a pasture setting. Lots of what we talked about yesterday. I had a handful of conversations about technologies in the pipeline that will allow us in Tennessee, right, very mountainous, trying to go out and actually quantify in these seed stock herds methane emissions so that we can develop and deliver these tools to producers. Again, whether you're in Tennessee, whether you're in West Texas, this is at my wife's place, it's really, really challenging to lay hands on these animals, let alone to deliver a feed additive, but even to capture a consistent methane emissions phenotype, plopping a green feed pasture system out in the middle of a 1,000-acre tract and expecting to get a sufficient number of records to develop a selection tool is going to be really challenging. It's going to take some intentionality for us across the beef genetics world to get these data sets put together and deployed in the form of selection tools. And so the last thing I want to mention is I'll put my extension hat on and take my genetics hat off. And I'll talk a little bit about this Master Beef Producer Program. This is a University of Tennessee extension program. We've got a handful of beef extension specialists. We train somewhere in the neighborhood of 5,000 to 7,000 beef producers across our state annually. And for the last few years, we've been partnered with the U.S. Roundtable for Sustainable Beef, and we've put a sustainability tilt on these conversations. When you first walk into a room full of beef cattle producers and you start talking about sustainability, something that we all agree is a positive thing, that we'd all agree that beef producers are actually working towards every day, whether they know it or not, heckles go up, right? And so we have some work to do, I think, on how we message, how we reach these beef producers where they're at, and talk about all of these technologies and how they can increase profitability, increase their efficiency while making their production more sustainable. So one of the big challenges that I think gets overlooked too a lot in the beef industry is just how small most of these operations are. So somewhere around 50% of U.S. beef comes from operations with less than 100 head. And these are multi-generational family businesses and beef producers are as stuck in their ways as anybody, right? Going to a dairy producer, they're a lot more profit motivated. They have a lot better understanding, I think, sometimes of dollars and cents. Whereas beef producers, a lot of times, they'll sacrifice profit for ease of access to something, right? They've got a job in town, they have cows to keep the grass mowed, right? So how do we reach these producers where maybe the traditional incentives, even monetary ones, maybe aren't large enough to shift production practices? So just something for us to think about, regardless of whether it's genetics, feed additives, or anything else in this space. Beef producers, the medium beef producer, 25 to 40 head, right? How do we make them understand that they have a role in this ability to make our production more sustainable and reduce methane globally? That's going to be a really, really important constituency to hit, and we have to keep extension at the forefront of our minds as we do that. So that's all I've got there, and look forward to talking more on the rest of the panel.